As our tools for exploring this vast expanse continue to improve, the answer to our question comes more clearly into focus. It's now estimated that for every grain of sand on planet Earth, there is another Earth-like planet capable of sustaining life. So, can we truly be alone?
I'm going to introduce a man who says there are more things between heaven and hell than any of us have accepted. And I have the witnesses and the documents to prove it. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Stephen Greer.
On May 9th, 2001, 20 military, government, and corporate witnesses held a press conference in Washington, D.C.
And these are folks who have been involved in so-called black budget or covert unacknowledged projects.
They described a decades-long conspiracy to cover up extraterrestrial visitation to Earth.
These unacknowledged special access projects are taking in at least $40 to $80 billion per year.
And the study of extraterrestrial technology in covert military programs.
And they are sitting on technologies that can change the world forever.
This technology would liberate Earth from fossil fuels, environmental devastation, and poverty in a single generation.
I didn't believe in UFOs until London Control called us in the winter of 1962 and asked us, would we chase one?
Their testimony would make history.
I said, well, you're going to tell the public about it. And he says, no, we don't tell the public about this. It would panic the public.
This was the most watched event in the history of the National Press Club.
We actually did recoveries of crashed saucers. There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive.
It marks the beginning of the global disclosure movement.
These discs were hovering off the floor without any visible means of support. They were referred to as alien reproduction vehicles.
15 years later, Dr. Stephen Greer opened his archives of documents and interviews.
This information was refused to the President of the United States by the Director of Central Intelligence, George Bush Sr.
They reveal the true story of the secrecy and of disclosure.
There is no evidence, I wish to emphasize, that these life forms from elsewhere are hostile towards us. But there is a great deal of evidence that they are concerned with our hostility.
This is that story. The phenomenon of UFOs does exist, and it must be treated seriously. Mikhail Gorbachev.
One of my biggest disappointments over the last 25 years is those who lack the courage of their convictions. If 1% of the people who I've talked with, met with, or briefed had that courage, this would have all been fixed long ago. I've always told them, if you won't do it, I will. So here goes.
For all I know, we may be visited by a different extraterrestrial civilization every second Tuesday. But there's no support for this appealing idea. The extraordinary claims are not supported by extraordinary evidence.
It's always asked, where's the evidence or where's the beef on the UFO issue? In fact, we have so much evidence that Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was in charge of Project Blue Book for the Air Force, stated that it's an embarrassment of riches. We have so much.
I'm Richard Doty. I was assigned as a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations at Kirtland Air Force Base. I was a counterintelligence officer at the base. During my time there, my first few months there, I was briefed into a special access program involving the U.S. government's investigation and contacts with extraterrestrial, the visitation of these extraterrestrials to Earth.
I can assure you that flying saucers, given that they exist, are not constructed by any power on Earth. President Harry S. Truman.
And it started out with a crash at Roswell.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying dish has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
Roswell's almost become a joke because there's so much myth and narrative around it. But if you look at the Guy Hotel document, it was a field agent sent to J. Edgar Hoover. 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape, but only 3 feet tall. It's become the #1 document viewed on the FBI website after we released this.
Now, the craft was more or less an oval or egg-shaped craft. It wasn't saucer-shaped.
That particular craft, there were some problems with, number one, getting it on the flatbed to take it up to Area 51.
The interior craft was, it didn't have any actual levers or flight control systems that we would identify as a flight control system. But they eventually, I think, over some time, figured it out. And it was done all by hands. The creatures would put their hands on controls, and they'd have this headset on, and this headset would somehow control or help them control the aircraft.
Well, they did discuss the fact that there were bodies. Extraterrestrial bodies, yes.
The creatures were about 4 foot. Some of the creatures were mangled, were heavily injured, and their bodies were torn apart.
There were 4 aliens aboard that thing, and those aliens went to Los Alamos.
And we were told that the extraterrestrial went to Kirtland Field, Kirtland Air Force Base, and then on to Los Alamos.
2 pathologists said there wasn't anything in the anatomy books, there wasn't anything in what our medical schools. They had never seen anything like this.
First I thought it was a child because it was small. Then I looked at its head and all. The head was different, the arms were spindly, the body was gray.
But the creatures were approximately 4 foot. They had didn't appear to have any ears.
They only had 2 orifices. They didn't have earlobes. They had 2 ear canals.
They had an indentation for the nose, very, very big eyes.
The large eyes.
The fingers had no thumbs, just four fingers. Suction devices on their tips of their fingers.
You know, the 4 fragile fingers and the long arm, real short joint.
Almost looked like they were nude, but they actually had a very thin but tight-fitting suit on.
One was alive, partially alive at the time that this happened.
It died in I believe it was 1952. But the bodies of the extraterrestrials that were found at the scene were in a deep freeze, placed in a deep freeze, and sent to Wright Pat Field in Dayton, Ohio.
One of the briefing officers that was taking us around and talking about what was going on, they said there had been over 100 crashes in that Four Corners area.
After Roswell, there was a flurry of ET activity across the globe. Dr. Greer spent 8 years trying to persuade members of Congress and other high-level government officials in the intelligence community to disclose what was happening, but to no avail. So in 2001, he formed the Disclosure Project. What you're about to see is first-hand witness testimony of events over the past 50 years. Many are telling their stories for the first time. This is only the tip of the iceberg, as hundreds more have given us their testimony, but are too fearful to go on camera, for fear of repercussions for themselves and for their families. I feel that the Air Force has not been giving out all the available information on these unidentified flying objects. You cannot disregard so many unimpeachable sources. Honorable John McCormick, Speaker of the House.
I'm one of those what you would call the high government officials in the FAA. I was a division chief. There was only 3 or 4 down from the admiral. The way it started is Japanese airline 747 was coming from the northwest going across the Alaskan territory. So his radar is picking up a target. He sees this target with his eye, and the target, the way he described it, was a huge ball with lights running around it, 4 times as big as a 747. The Japanese pilot would say he's now at 11 o'clock, he's now at 1 o'clock, he's now at 3 o'clock. When he would say that, the military guy would cut in and say he's now at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and he would confirm the position. He said this is the first time they ever had 30 minutes of radar data on a UFO, and they're all itching to get their hands into the data. And if they come out and told the American public that they ran into a UFO out there, it would cause panic across the country, so therefore you can't talk about it. And they're taking all this data. And I had the pilot's report that came through, and I had the FAA's first report that was all downstairs on my table. They didn't ask for that, and so I didn't give it to them.
The plane that I was going to be flying in was an F-104, which was the fastest known aircraft to mankind at that time. So we're flying down the Rhine River. We're up at high altitude, and about that time, I spot a bogey at about 10 o'clock over here. I don't recognize the craft. I said, "Bogey, 10 o'clock." And the captain looked over there and said, "Well, let's find out." So he kicked it into afterburner, and we went after that, and it disappeared just like that. He says, "Please, whatever you do, do not say anything about this encounter. It will get me in much trouble." So that was my first introduction to cover up.
So everything was going along pretty just ho-hum routine. They dimmed the lights first in the command center when they set a condition zebra alert. Most of the times when they set these drills, they would say, "This is a drill, this is a drill." But they turned the lights down this time and they didn't say, "This is a drill." We had contact with an unidentified flying object that had entered our airspace. We had it on radar for almost an hour. The order was given by Admiral Train to try and get this object forced down out of the sky, if at all possible, by whatever means possible. What was really driving him nuts was this thing absolutely had complete control of the situation and could just be wherever it wanted to be just in a matter of seconds. 1 minute off the coast of Maine, the next minute it's in Norfolk, headed south towards Florida. And after we found out it wasn't the Russians, they didn't care who it was or where it was from. They wanted it and wanted it bad.
At various times, I loaded and unloaded nuclear weapons, and I was considered sane, so to speak, and able to handle nuclear weapons. But apparently UFOs are, well, I know that they're well above even nuclear weapons in secrecy. One particular night, we just finished our refueling mission. London Control called us and asked us if we would intercept a UFO over the center of England, roughly in the Stonehenge, Oxford area. We're up at 33,000 feet, and the UFO was down at about 1,000 feet. We dove on it. Eventually, we got up to close to it, and we could see what looked like a cruise ship out at sea with all the lights and everything. Got about a mile from it, and it went up into space. London Control said, "You can continue on with your mission." Apparently, Prince Philip felt it was very important. We were invited to dinner at the Officers Club where he was the speaker, and he knew all about the fact that we had chased the UFO. He kind of made me a believer in a sense. I had seen him personally, of course, before that, but when someone of his stature indicates that they're real and probably from another planet, it's very convincing.
I believe that these ET vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets, which obviously are a little more technically advanced than we are here on Earth. Astronaut Gordon Cooper.
We should go boldly where man has not gone before. Fly by the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there? Who put that there?
Dr. Greer has been around people with top-secret clearance his whole life. His uncle helped to design the original lunar module that put the first men on the moon. In 1961, President Kennedy challenged NASA to put Americans in space and on the moon by the end of the decade.
Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The Disclosure Project archives includes testimony from extraordinary individuals who were part of this great effort to explore outer space, including astronauts Gordon Cooper and Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon.
Yes, there have been ET visitation, there have been crashed craft, there have been material and bodies recovered, and there is some group of people somewhere that may or may not be associated with government at this point, but certainly were at one time, that have this knowledge and have been attempting to conceal this knowledge.
We walked over to one side of the lab and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose?
Well, let's see, we've had visitors again. Yeah. Probably worth mentioning. Recreation.
And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings. There were very tall towers and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. And at that point, I became frightened and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information.
The crew of the carrier Kearsarge goes into action off Midway Island in the Pacific for the return of a hero, Major Gordon Cooper. The capsule door is blown off and Cooper's flight ends, a performance that exceeded the most optimistic predictions.
I was having some cameramen film the installation of a precision landing facility we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake, and this saucer flew right over them and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming, and he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. I was involved in the research and development and doing very classified programs myself, so I knew that we didn't have any vehicles of that kind. The Russians didn't have any of that type either. At that point in time, there was no doubt in my mind that this vehicle was made at some other place than here on Earth.
We're watching 8 News Now at 11.
Officially, the U.S. government ended its study of UFOs in 1969 because it assured the public there is no proof the phenomenon represents a threat to national security.
But what if these unknown aircraft showed an interest in our nuclear weapons? A group of more than 150 military veterans, missile officers, security personnel, including many who worked at the Nevada test site, say they've seen mystery intruders over nuclear facilities.
This concept, Vandenberg Air Force Base, California, has become the first aerospace operations center of the Air Force.
They actually photographed the UFO following the missile as it climbed into space and shining a beam on it, which neutralized the missile.
It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, which is represented by my thumb here. So this thing fires a beam of light at the warhead, hits it, and then this thing flies up like this, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. and the warhead tumbles out of space. Now, when the lights came on, Major Mansman turned around and looked at me and said, "Were you guys screwing around up there?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "What was that?" And I said, "It looks to me like we got a UFO."
The idea of any explosion in space by any Earth government was not acceptable to the extraterrestrials, and that has been demonstrated over and over.
How is that demonstrated?
By the destruction of any nuclear weapons sent into space.
It was early in the morning. I received a call from my topside security guard. He and some of the guards had been observing some strange lights flying around the launch control facility. And I said, "Well, you mean UFO?" I think I used that word. He didn't know what they were, but they were lights that were flying around. I just kind of shook my head and just said, "Well, call me if anything more important than that happens." He calls back, and this time he's very frightened. I can tell by the tone of his voice he's very shook up, and said, "Sir, there's a glowing red object hovering right outside the front gate." And as I was relating this to him, our missiles started shutting down one by one. The Air Force did an extensive investigation of the entire incident and was not able to come up with a probable cause for the shutdowns. The missiles are not connected to each other. Having a fault at one site would not affect missiles at another location.
Assuming that they've always been there, but what caused this great interest in us, this large incursion after 47? And I remember he thought for a moment, he said, "Well, obviously, the atom bomb."
A 1.5 stage, 132-ton ballistic device, now fully operational after an evolutionary background of more than 50 years of powered flight.
Roswell was not the beginning. It was a turning point.
We just dropped 2 bombs on a country. We had a test of that bomb a few months earlier, or a few weeks earlier in New Mexico. This probably was observed by these aliens somewhere, whether they were doing reconnaissance back then or how they ever figured it out. So they came here to observe and try to figure out what the heck was that.
At the time of the crash, shortly after the detonation of the first atomic weapons, Roswell was the only nuclear-armed squadron in the world.
If you accept the multidimensional theory, it's highly likely that we've done a hell of a lot of damage. In somebody else's world, they might have even done more damage there than we did here.
The underlying theme that connects most of the Disclosure Project case files is the fact that these close encounters tend to occur near our nuclear facilities, suggesting that these visitors are deeply concerned with our hostility and the existential threat that we pose to ourselves and others once we learned to split the atom.
These are some of the highest-ranking military officials in our defense program. They're trusted with, nuclear weapons. They're trusted with top-level security clearances and secrets. But the minute that they start talking about this particular subject, they become pariah.
I believe the American people are entitled to a more thorough explanation than has been given them by the Air Force. I think we owe it to the people to establish credibility regarding UFOs and to produce the greatest possible enlightenment of the subject. Former President Gerald Ford.
I am prepared to state that I have been at locations where craft of unknown origin that did not originate on the face of this planet was there. I am prepared to state that while I was there, we saw living, dead bodies of entities that were not born on this planet. I am prepared to state that we had what they referred to as interfacing with those entities.
Never is there any compelling physical evidence.
The question is, who are people like Carl Sagan, and before him, Professor Donald Menzel? It turns out that Sagan, in his early career, actually spoke and wrote about UFOs in a way that was affirmative, that was legitimate. After he was threatened by the intelligence community and blackmailed. He then began to debunk the issue. Skepticism is very healthy, and I'm a big skeptic about more than 90% of the information out there on the subject, which the public needs to be skeptical. However, skepticism is not just blindly denying everything that's legitimate. For example, we have 3,500 cases where extraterrestrial vehicles have landed and left physical traces. We have 4,000 cases where they have been tracked on radar and seen by pilots. We have an enormous amount of photo and video evidence and physical evidence. And in our last project, brought out an actual body that is most likely not of human origin. So the question becomes, what is the metric for the evidence? Well, the evidence is actually overwhelming. There's more evidence for UFOs than there are for black holes, most of the theories in astrophysics, most of the evidence for most of the medicines you take. I'm speaking now as a trauma doctor. And yet, we have this blockage in the mainstream media and scientific establishment saying, where is the evidence?
What do we know? We know now we live in an ever-expanding universe. We know that there are billions of stars and planets literally out there, and the universe is getting bigger. We know from our fancy telescopes that just in the last 2 years, more than 20 planets have been identified outside our solar system that seem to be far enough away from their suns and dense enough that they might be able to support some form of life. So it makes it increasingly less likely that we're alone.
Of course, flying saucers are real, and they are interplanetary. Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding.
When I was 8 or 9, I saw one of these objects, broad daylight. There was a beautiful, seamless disk in a blue sky, back when the skies were very blue. And I was with some boys in the neighborhood, and we saw this, and I went, oh my God, they're real. We saw a UFO. Now, my parents said, oh, well, you're just a kid. But I became completely absorbed in this. So my interest in this goes back to my childhood. The Disclosure Project was an accident of history. In 1990, I formed the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence to form a diplomatic corps to make peaceful contact with these civilizations. Because once you conclude that they're real and they're of interstellar origin, the next question is, what are we going to do about it? And so I concluded what we should be doing about it is not militarizing the relationship, but having sort of a citizens' diplomacy effort, much like the Physicians for Social Responsibility, who were going to the Soviet Union to create a dialogue during the coldest days of the Cold War. There was no one at the United Nations or State Department or any foreign ministry dealing with it. So we started a set of protocols to make contact. And sure enough, we had some spectacular successes.
Holy damn hot shit. Dog. Thank you.
This got kicked up to the intelligence community. So by 1992, I was getting visits from the head of Army Intelligence, people inside the National Security Agency, and other three-lettered agencies. My intention was never to get involved with trying to disclose this issue. My interest was in this whole concept of making contact for peaceful purposes to advance our civilization from a planetary civilization to an interplanetary civilization. That was really the heart of my sincere interest. But along that way, and eventually a man who was friends with the director of the CIA, by the time Clinton became president, who said, you're going to be the first person to brief the director of Central Intelligence and the Clinton administration on this, because they have made inquiries and they have been lied to, which I did not believe. I mean, he was that blunt about it. This is really where I then went down the rabbit hole.
So can the government keep a secret this big? One of the biggest weapons in the intelligence community's arsenal is our general belief that the U.S. government couldn't possibly keep a secret this big from the American public. But the existence of the National Reconnaissance Office remained secret for over 30 years. The mere existence of the NSA, jokingly referred to as no such agency, was kept secret until it grew so large that it was quite conspicuous. And those working in the Manhattan Project developing the atom bomb were told that any secrets that they disclose would result in 10 years in prison, or an equivalent of a $100,000 fine. Only when the weapons were used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki did the government disclose what they were.
Of all things, to keep secret the fact that there is this bountiful option that we have of reaching out into the stars and being friendly neighbors with other civilizations and sharing information and sharing resources and sharing knowledge and sharing spiritual insights and values. To suppress that information and to conceal it is part of the efforts of a national security state that is threatened by that reality. And so that this is one of the ultimate secrets that needs to be exposed.
We have indeed been contacted, perhaps even visited, by extraterrestrial beings. And the U.S. government, in collusion with the other national powers of the Earth, is determined to keep this information from the general public. Victor Marchetti, former special assistant to the executive director of the CIA.
And in this document from the Canadian government, the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher than the H-bomb. That was the most top secret doomsday weapon at the time in development. And the second item, B, flying saucers exist, period. C, their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. And then D, the entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. What is more sensitive than the development of the hydrogen bomb prior to its detonation? The UFO issue. A priori, therefore, the entire subject has been managed in a way from the 40s onward with extraordinary secrecy around it. The event at Roswell, because it resulted in the acquisition of materiel that could be studied, it created a sea change in the whole national security organization, because within weeks of that event, the CIA was formed. Within weeks, there was the formation of the Air Force, which was split off from the Army Air Force. It also led, however, the development of unacknowledged special access projects, which is why Eisenhower, even though he knew about the subject on a fairly deep level, had completely lost control of it by 1961 when he left office.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You know, because you think of generals and you think of conservatives and Republicans as being very pro-military in business, but he's talking about the illegal part of it. He's not talking about the conventional military.
But it's now the military-industrial intelligence complex that are moving bureaucratically toward establishing dominion and control over the entire democratic process in the country, and that they're waging war, invading the Middle Eastern oil fields and occupying the oil fields, attempting to establish what they themselves refer to as full spectrum dominance.
But we're going to smoke them out.
And so the public has to understand there became to be this bifurcation, this separation between legitimate national security and military operations and the deep black programs that are unacknowledged. We're talking about the black budget, the deep black, super secret, unacknowledged budget that runs in the $100 to $200 billion a year. I'm being conservative.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
We're spending well over $100 million per day on classified programs that have no congressional oversight, no public scrutiny. There's no monitor of these programs. A number of these programs go directly through Congress, totally. When you start going through these documents, these programs start dropping off the radar screen. These are all classified programs within the defense budget but they don't supply any technical information on the program.
And if people think that the Congress and the President actually have a handle on this, they're gravely mistaken. They do not. This is where we get into the structure of secrecy.